A woman was dragged from her porch in broad daylight by fake HOA enforcers, beaten, humiliated, and almost taken. They wore tactical vests, carried forged papers, and thought no one would stop them. But her husband, a Marine veteran named Jacob Willis, remembered everything. Faces, steps, fear, and stepped in before it was too late. And you won't believe how this nightmare unraveled in court, and why justice didn't just knock. It kicked the door wide open. Saturday mornings in Redfield, Ohio always had a rhythm. Slow, steady, quiet. The kind of quiet that blanketed the neighborhood like fog, soft and unbothered. On this one, the sun had just begun its climb, rays spilling lazily over the white porch rails of the Willis house. The air smelled like cut grass and warm earth. Nothing was out of place. Jacob Willis stood in his garage, sleeves rolled, oil on his hands, squinting at a lawnmower that hadn't run right since spring. Emily, his wife of 17 years, was inside flipping pancakes, humming that same little tune she'd hummed since college. The melody drifted faintly through the open windows, mixing with the sound of birds and the gentle creak of the porch swing where their golden retriever Duke dozed in peace. It was the kind of morning people prayed for, familiar, predictable, safe. Then came the scream. Not a shout, not a startled yelp. This was something else. A jagged, ragged sound that sliced through the air and made Jacob's heart lurch. Every instinct honed in a rock and buried under years of calm came roaring back. The wrench dropped from his hand and clattered to the concrete as he bolted out of the garage. The front yard opened before him, and time slowed. Emily was being dragged down the porch steps. Two men in dark tactical vests had her. One had her by the arm. The other gripped a fistful of her hair. Her nightgown, the one with little yellow sunflowers on it, was twisted around her knees. Her legs scraped the wood. Her face, bloodied lip, eyes wide and glassy, cheeks stained with tears, didn't look real. She didn't even scream anymore, just whimpered like an animal too shocked to run. Jacob's voice thundered. "What are you doing? Get off her!" One of the men snapped. "Back in the house, sir. HOA enforcement. This doesn't concern you." But Jacob wasn't just a homeowner. He was a husband, a protector. And as his eyes scanned them, too clean gear, badges that caught the light wrong, insignias he didn't recognize, he knew. Those weren't officers. They were fakes. The vests were airsoft-style knockoffs. The patches were stitched wrong. The lettering looked like it came off a home printer. Their stance wasn't tactical. It was sloppy, nervous, predatory. And then Jacob saw it. The black Escalade idling at the curb, engine purring low, no plates. Back window cracked just enough to glimpse a third shadowy figure watching. They weren't here for a fine. They weren't enforcing anything. For half a second, Jacob couldn't move. His hands shook, not from fear, but from rage, too cold to scream. His brain cataloged everything. The angle of their grip, the blood trickling from Emily's lip, the way her slipper had fallen off and landed upside down on the bottom step. Every detail etched into him like a scar. He took one step forward. The taller man twitched, as if ready to draw something from his vest. Jacob didn't flinch. "This is your last warning," the man growled. "Go back inside, or you'll be cited for obstruction." Jacob's voice came low, slow, steady. "You think I care about a citation?" Emily tried to speak. Her voice cracked. "Jake." That sound nearly broke him. His wife, the woman who made life make sense, reduced to pleading through pain. That's when it changed. No more hesitation, no more questions. Jacob turned back toward the house, not because he was retreating, but because he knew what came next had to be handled with precision. He knew how this would end. Inside the garage, behind the workbench and beneath a layer of dust, sat the locked case he hadn't opened in years. Not since the day he promised Emily he was done with violence. But this wasn't violence. This was defense. This was the promise he made on their wedding day coming due. And with every step he took toward that case, he knew. Some lines, once crossed, don't get walked back, but some moments demand it. And this moment belonged to him. Emily's cries echoed against the metal of the black SUV as her knees scraped across the driveway. Her fingernails clawed at the pavement, desperate to find something to hold onto, to anchor herself. The gravel bit into her skin, but she didn't stop. Her eyes were wide, frantic, searching for Jacob. Her voice cracked under the weight of fear. One man locked both her wrists behind her back, pressing them tight with plastic restraints. The other kept a brutal grip on her hair, tugging her toward the back seat like she was nothing more than cargo. The door to the SUV was open now, its dark interior yawning like a trap. Jacob sprinted forward, heart pounding against his ribs, but he didn't make it far. The taller man turned in one motion, arm extended, pointing what looked like a black stun device. Jacob froze mid-stride, eyes locking on the weapon. "Don't take another step," the man warned, his tone cold, practiced. "This is HOA enforcement. You violated the community covenant. Illegal fencing, unpaid dues. This property's under seizure." Jacob's mouth opened, but Emily beat him to it. Her voice, raw and furious, tore through the morning air. "We paid. Last week. It's auto-drafted every month." The man holding her didn't even blink. None of this made sense, but it was never meant to. This wasn't about community rules or overdue statements. It was about power, control, fear, and Jacob knew it. Across the street, a curtain twitched. Someone peeked through the blinds, only to vanish a second later. Another neighbor stood frozen behind a glass door, phone in hand, filming, but not moving. Not helping. Jacob's fists curled at his sides, not in panic, but in calculation. He scanned every detail: height of the man with the weapon, the distance between them, the arc of Emily's back as she struggled to breathe. He noted the angle of her head, the location of the open car door, the thin red mark already forming near her temple. He counted silently. 1. The man with the device stood about 10 feet away. 2. The driveway slope favored him. 3. His stance was tense, not tactical. Amateur. Probably fast on reaction, slow on aim. Jacob blinked once, exhaled through his nose. Then, without a word, he turned. The men laughed, short, breathy laughs. Thought they had won, thought the man walking away had given up. But Jacob wasn't walking away. He was walking towards something. Through the front door, past the hallway photos, into the master closet. The carpet remembered his steps. His hand found the floor hatch behind the coats. The code on the lock? Muscle memory. Inside the safe, cradled in velvet, sat the M4 he hadn't touched in 8 years. Last fired at a range in Kentucky. Clean, oiled, ready. He stared at it for just a second, long enough to remember why he stopped using it, and why now he couldn't afford not to. Outside, the laughter had stopped. From behind the blinds, faces watched, unsure of what was happening, unsure if they were witnessing justice or just another tragedy unfolding. But no one stepped in. Not yet. Jacob's pulse steadied as he lifted the rifle from its cradle. The familiar weight settled into his arms like an old friend returned. He checked the chamber, clipped on the sling, and took one last breath in the silence of the house they had built together. He didn't see himself as a hero. Heroes waited too long. Heroes begged. He wasn't going to beg. Down the hallway, back through the door, the light had changed. Shadows were longer. The air was heavier. The world had shifted, and Jacob with it. Each step was slow. Purposeful. Not rushed. Not panicked. Controlled. This wasn't just about stopping a crime. This was about setting the scale back to balance, 1 inch at a time. The sound echoed like thunder in a bottle. The click of the M16 charging handle, sharp and final, sliced through the quiet like a starting bell. To Jacob, it was louder than sirens, louder than shouting, louder than the blood in his ears. It was the sound of a decision made, of a line crossed for all the right reasons. He hadn't touched that rifle in almost 10 years. Bought it when he came back from Fallujah, not for display, but for the one promise he swore to keep, that if evil ever touched his home, he would meet it head-on, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Now, that promise stood on the front porch with him, forged in steel, resting steady in his hands. Jacob stepped out slowly, deliberately, as if the air had thickened. His boots touched the wooden planks one by one, the weight of every memory pressing down. His oath, his training, his family. He didn't tremble. He didn't breathe fast. He had walked into danger before, but never with stakes like this. The two men near the SUV turned as one. The taller of the two froze mid-motion, eyes locking on the rifle. The other, more jittery, flinched and reached for his taser again. A rookie mistake. Jacob didn't wait. His voice rang out, sharp and unyielding. Let her go. Now, or I end this. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His words carried the weight of someone who meant every syllable. Someone who had seen what hesitation cost. Someone who would never let it happen again. The man with the taser hesitated. His hand trembled midair, fingers twitching between fight and flight. Emily lay beside the SUV, half conscious, her hair tangled, a single slipper dangling from her foot. Her blouse was torn near the collar, her face pale with shock. But when she saw Jacob, when her eyes met his, her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her shoulders relaxed just a bit. Her chest shook with a sob that turned into a gasp. She remembered who he was. She remembered that she was safe now. The SUV engine suddenly revved. The man by the back door turned slightly, panic flickering in his eyes. "Don't," Jacob said, voice like gravel. "Move." The threat wasn't in the volume. It was in the stillness. He didn't twitch, didn't blink. The rifle was aimed low but ready. His finger hovered near the trigger guard, steady as stone. "Drop to your knees," Jacob ordered, "hands on your head." They didn't move. He took a half step forward. "And kiss her feet." At first, there was silence. The wind rattled a hanging planter near the porch rail. A neighbor's wind chime jingled faintly in the distance. And then, the men laughed. It wasn't full laughter, just a short, surprised scoff. They thought he was bluffing. So Jacob squeezed the trigger once. The bullet punched the ground 2 inches in front of their boots, kicking up a small burst of gravel and dust. The report echoed off the houses like a firecracker fired inside a canyon. Both men dropped instantly. Hands shot into the air, knees slammed into the driveway. One of them whimpered. The other looked like he'd seen a ghost. Jacob kept the rifle leveled, eyes steady. "You think this is a joke?" he asked, tone even. "You think dragging my wife across our lawn makes you brave?" They shook their heads. No more words. "Now," Jacob repeated, "kiss her feet." There was a pause, long, ugly, the kind that tests souls. Then slowly, shamefully, one of them leaned forward and lowered his face to the driveway beside Emily's foot. A quiet, broken kiss. The second followed, lips brushing against the tip of her heel like it burned him. Jacob didn't smile. This wasn't victory. This was justice measured, one breath at a time. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The scene spoke for itself. For every second she screamed, for every scratch on her arms, for every neighbor who watched and didn't move. He stood there, not as a soldier, not even as a husband, but as a wall no one would ever cross again without consequence. And behind him, Emily lay no longer alone. The two men collapsed like puppets whose strings had been cut. One dropped fast, like gravity hit him harder than anyone else on earth. The other stumbled, caught himself on one knee, and then lowered the rest of the way, as if his limbs no longer belonged to him. Their hands hovered awkwardly in the air, unsure whether to shield, to beg, or to simply surrender. Sweat poured down their faces in rivulets, cutting paths through the dirt and panic. Their uniforms, if they could be called that, hung crooked, their fake patches fluttering with every shallow breath. One of them, the older one, began whispering to himself. Frantic words, maybe a prayer, maybe an apology to no one in particular. His lips moved faster than his breath could keep up. The other shook. Not a tremble, but a full body quake, like his bones had turned to glass, and the fear was rattling through them. His eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto the barrel of Jacob's rifle. Jacob stood tall, unshaken. The rifle didn't waver. His stance hadn't changed since the moment he'd taken that porch. Safety off, trigger ready, focus razor sharp. "Kiss her feet," he said again, voice low, steady, and final. The words didn't shout. They carved. The man nearest to Emily blinked up at Jacob, his chin twitching. "Please." Jacob's jaw tensed. "She's bleeding because of you. Because you believed a fake vest gave you real power. Because you thought fear was something you could hand out like warnings. So now, you'll show her the respect you thought she didn't deserve. You'll kneel, and you'll honor the woman you tried to break." It wasn't rage that powered his voice. It was conviction. Cold, deep, earned. The older man broke first. He crawled the remaining inches forward, shaking so badly his shoulder nearly gave out. Then, with eyes closed and a sound somewhere between a sob and a breath, he bent and pressed his lips to the arch of Emily's foot. Bruised, bloodied, bare on the concrete. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I'm sorry." The words barely left his mouth before his head fell, and he remained there, forehead pressed to the ground. The second man hesitated, frozen. His chest heaved like he'd run miles, and his gaze darted from Jacob's stance to the house, to the growing crowd of witnesses standing silent across the street. His lips parted, but he didn't move. Then Jacob chambered around. The metallic sound snapped across the lawn like a warning bell in a courtroom. It was not just a threat. It was punctuation. The man flinched so hard his knees scraped against the driveway, and he too lowered himself. His hands trembled as he reached toward Emily's ankle. He kissed her foot, fast, quiet, shameful. And it was done. Emily, still gasping from the pain, her body half curled on the pavement, lifted her head just enough to see Jacob's face. Her voice came out soft, cracked with everything she'd endured. "Jake, stop." He didn't answer right away. His gaze had shifted, just past the SUV, just beyond the driveway. There they were, neighbors, dozens. Some on porches, some halfway down their steps, some with phones raised, recording, others with hands over their mouths, and among them, silence. Eyes filled with things words couldn't hold. Some cried, some stood still, unmoving, as if the air had turned solid, and a few, just a few, clapped, slow, quiet. Not for spectacle, but for truth. Jacob finally exhaled. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning long overdue. He looked down at Emily, her hand weakly resting on the ground, her eyes glistening with a mix of pain and disbelief. In that moment, he realized the real message hadn't come from the muzzle of the rifle, but from the silence that followed. It was the silence of people who had watched for too long, and the sound of power returning to where it always should have been, in her breath, in her eyes, in her dignity reclaimed. The street was quiet now, but it wasn't the quiet of fear. It was the quiet of respect, earned. Though the sirens hadn't yet pierced the sky, the neighborhood was already wide awake. Flashing lights blinked from dozens of phones, all pointed at the same image, a man standing over two trembling figures. Jacob Willis didn't pose, didn't speak. He simply stood, steady as a monument, the rifle angled toward the ground, but held with quiet authority. His breathing was even, his eyes clear. This wasn't pride, it was protection. On the pavement before him, the fake officers remained on their knees, hands limp at their sides. Their faces were cut and dust-covered. Their mouths, once shouting threats and orders, were now silent, pressed tight with fear. The illusion they wore had peeled off in real time. Their cheap gear no longer meant anything. Behind Jacob, Emily lay curled against the side of the SUV. Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, but her eyes stayed open now, fixed on the man who stood between her and everything that had tried to steal her dignity. Each second behind his silhouette returned a piece of her breath. She was still hurting, but she was no longer afraid. A voice called out from the left, uncertain, high-pitched, breaking with nerves. "Mr. Willis." It was Evan Henderson, 17 years old, lived across the street. He stood frozen on his family's front lawn, holding his phone like a shield, his thumb hovering over the record button, even though it had already been pressed. His eyes were wide. He didn't understand what he was seeing, only that something enormous had just unfolded in front of him. What are they? Jacob didn't glance over. He didn't need to. "Pretenders," he said. "Thieves. Cowards. Hiding behind fake badges because wearing a real one takes courage. The street held its breath. Then a woman's voice came from somewhere behind the boy, older, softer, but carrying the same question that had spread through the crowd like smoke. "Why her?" she asked. "Why Emily?" Jacob finally turned, not his shoulders, just his head, and nodded toward the SUV. On the passenger seat sat a clipboard. From where they stood, they could see the edges of documents peeking out. But Jacob had already seen them up close. He knew what was on them. "Forged violations," he said. "Fake fines, fabricated names and codes, a list of addresses. They've been doing this for 2 weeks. Same pattern, same method." He paused, then added with quiet certainty, "They target homes where women are home alone." Someone gasped. A low murmur passed through the neighbors like a ripple across still water. Suddenly, everything changed. The fear that had gripped the block gave way to something heavier, realization. People began lowering their phones, no longer recording, just watching, trying to make sense of what had almost happened, what had been happening to others, and what Jacob had just stopped. Children clung tighter to parents. Couples exchanged looks that held more than words. It was as if the street itself, long considered peaceful and predictable, had revealed a fault line beneath its surface. Jacob remained still. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence, and what it meant, was already etched into the moment. Then, faint at first, but rising fast, came the unmistakable sound of real sirens. The kind that cut through wind. The kind that meant authority was finally arriving. Jacob didn't flinch. He simply adjusted the strap of the rifle, still pointed down, and turned his eyes toward the sound. He wasn't waiting for backup. He was waiting for accountability. And the block, so often silent, so often passive, stood still in collective reckoning. For the first time, they weren't watching through glass. They weren't frozen in fear. They were witnesses, not just to what had happened, but to the strength it took to stop it. And in that moment, every neighbor knew the truth. If Jacob hadn't been home, this story would have ended differently. Much differently. The sirens grew louder, but for the first time that morning, the street felt quiet. Not empty. Just aware. Redfield PD arrived with a screech of tires and flashing lights. 2 cruisers boxed in the SUV. Officers spilled out with weapons raised, but dropped them the second they saw Jacob on his knees beside Emily, his rifle set gently on the ground. She gripped his arm tightly, as if letting go meant everything would collapse. Her face was pale, bruised, but calmer now. The danger was behind her, and Jacob was in front. 2 suspects restrained, an officer said into his radio. Victim identified. Civilian acted to stop the assault. Crowd footage confirms it. 1 officer stepped closer. Military? Jacob nodded. 3rd Battalion, Fallujah. The officer's reply was quiet. Then I understand. The 2 attackers were cuffed without a word. Their voices were gone. One slumped. The other stared at the ground, listening as the charges were read. Assault, impersonating an officer, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy. Emily sat on the bumper of the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket. Her lips trembled, not from cold, but from everything catching up at once. You said you'd protect me, she whispered, as Jacob took her hand. He gave a quiet nod. Always. Around them, neighbors stood silent, phones down, mouths closed. It was no longer about the recording. It was about what they had nearly allowed to happen. They've been doing this for weeks, Jacob muttered, pointing to a clipboard pulled from the SUV. Fake fines, lists, addresses, women home alone. A detective flipped through the forged documents. His face tightened. Same scam we've been chasing, but this time they picked the wrong address. Jacob didn't speak again. He just stayed beside Emily as they loaded her into the ambulance. And the neighborhood, once quiet and distant, stood still, fully aware now of how close they'd come to losing something they couldn't replace. The younger officer glanced around at the crowd, neighbors standing on lawns, silent, stunned. Some held phones. Most had lowered them. Whatever curiosity brought them out was now replaced with something quieter, respect. One teenager stepped forward. We saw everything. It's all recorded. When they grabbed her, when he stepped in. An officer nodded. We'll need that footage, but it's already clear what happened. Nearby, A medic spoke softly to Emily, checking her vitals, asking questions she barely answered. Her focus remained on Jacob. He hadn't left her side, not when the sirens came. Not now. "You really meant it," she said again, softer. "What you promised." He didn't reply. His hands simply closed around hers. The detective turned toward the vehicle. These guys were organized, not random. 6 hits in 2 weeks. Always used fake enforcement, always isolated homes. He paused, then looked back at Jacob. "They weren't ready for you." Jacob gave a single nod. No, they weren't. The cuffs clicked. The suspects were loaded into the cruisers without resistance. The sound of the doors slamming shut felt final. One officer muttered under his breath, "This could have ended a lot worse." It didn't, because someone was home, and someone was willing to do what needed to be done. As the ambulance pulled away with Emily inside, the street slowly began to breathe again. But it didn't forget. Long after the sirens faded and the last cruiser turned the corner, Jacob stood alone on the porch, not waiting, not watching, just standing, quiet, centered. The rifle remained untouched beside the steps, not as a threat, but as a reminder, not of what he did, but why. Behind him, the house was still, safe again. And every neighbor who passed in the days to come walked a little slower, looked a little longer, and remembered what one man chose to stand for when it mattered most. Within a day, Jacob Willis went from quiet veteran to a national symbol. News crews lined the street. Headlines dubbed him the protector of Redfield. Politicians chimed in. One senator posted, "When lawlessness meets a warrior, justice gets a face." The actual HOA issued a statement, distancing themselves and denouncing the impersonators. It turned out the attackers weren't members at all, just scammers using fake fines, cheap vests, and fear to take money and property. Their victims? Homes pulled from outdated delinquency lists. Jacob's address had been targeted by mistake. Someone 2 blocks away shared a similar last name, but that wasn't what the country talked about. Emily needed stitches. Her sleep would be fractured for weeks. Yet, when people asked what saved her, she never mentioned luck. She'd simply say, "My husband," and his memory. He remembered everything, their faces, their steps, and the look in their eyes when they realized they picked the wrong door. 1 week later, the courtroom was full. The trial began under a heavy silence. Cameras were barred, but the story already lived in headlines. People leaned in from the gallery as Jacob took the stand. He spoke plainly. No drama, no pride, just facts. He described the screams, the uniforms, the fear in Emily's eyes. He answered every question calmly, with the kind of clarity that comes from having lived through it without flinching. Then the prosecutor played the neighborhood footage, the moment the attackers dropped to their knees, the command, the hesitation, the kisses to Emily's wounded feet. The room went still. One juror blinked back a tear, another sat stiff, arms crossed, jaw set. The defense tried to shift the focus. They feared for their lives, their attorney claimed. They were under pressure. The district attorney replied without hesitation. They didn't fear for their lives. They feared being exposed. They feared consequences. Not bullets, truth. The verdict came fast. Guilty. On all counts. Outside, cameras clicked like rain on glass. Reporters called out for statements. Jacob said nothing until Emily's hand found his. Her grip was steady now. Her head was high. "Any regrets, Mr. Willis?" one voice asked. He looked at her quiet strength, at the light catching the shorter strands of her hair. "No," he said, "only that I didn't do it sooner." That night, they sat together on the porch, the swing gently rocking. The air was quiet, but not hollow, not anymore. Emily kissed his hand, the same hand that had steadied the rifle. "You made them kiss my feet," she whispered. Jacob nodded, "and they're lucky I didn't make them dig." She leaned in, her voice low but unshaken. "They'll never touch another woman again." And beneath that old swing, where peace had once been shattered, justice came home. Not with sirens, not with speeches, just with truth and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken. That night, Redfield didn't just sleep, it healed.